So what this talk is called is security in the age of software-defined machines. And what I mean by that is pretty simple. It's just the fact that the functionality of machines is increasingly being defined by software instead of mechanical, instead of other ways in terms that we defined it. And it shows no sign of stopping. Okay. And if we have this lack of understanding as we continue to move into, putting more cyber physical systems, hardware, software into control physical things, there could be a lot of bad consequences. And as you will see, a lot of what the problem really comes down to is how do we deal with complexity? And I'll define what complexity means here in a few slides. But, systems are complex. There is something that could be called essential complexity. You can't reduce everything so to such a low state of complexity that you throw away the essence of it. So we fully accept that there is this notion of essential complexity that you have to be able to cope with. But the challenge is that there is so much accidental complexity. Okay, complexity that are in these systems for no reason other than they're there. And accidental complexity is not my word. It actually goes back to, I think it's Fred Brooks who wrote The Mythical Man Month. I see you shaking your head. He was the one that really talked about what accidental complexity meant in terms of developing software and some of its implications. So it's definitely a dated book, but it's still a treasure historically about how he looked at software. And even if you don't read it, just go to the last pages of it where he tells the important points in every chapter. And so this is really what we're going to talk about today. A tractor, right? I would challenge anybody to find anything cyber in that tractor. And actually, it doesn't look very safe. And the thing that makes me scratch my head is that's a steam engine. Okay? I don't know how they're keeping the fire going in that tractor. I don't see any source of fuel. And that's just an aside. Okay, but that's that's what I mean by a machine. And a machine is not just a tractor. It's your electrical systems. It's your communication systems. It's basically anything that is not IT, information technology. We call that, or that is called OT, operational technology, because it has some aspect of using cyber to control something that is physical. Okay, the modern version of that is this. Okay, that is a John Deere tractor. Roughly 1,000 horsepower, costs $1 million, and two aspects about it. That's part of the control panel, okay? When you look at the specifications and you ask what can that do, so many of the functions in that tractor are now under cyber control. And it even can follow defined paths by GPS. It has AI in it to stay over top of the rows of the potatoes or whatever the tractor is going over top of so that it stays centered. And this has impacts in lots of ways. I'm not sure so much that farmers are worried about cyber attacks, but what they're more worried about are practices of John Deere. Okay, because they're using essentially this cyber fact that they can control who fixes the tractor, who has access to the functions, and a lot of farmers are not happy. They have to end up paying more for it. They have to end up sometimes not waiting in line at the John Deere place to get it serviced. And this resulted in a suit from the Federal Trade Commission. This is not the talk, but I just thought this was interesting to look at how, I don't want to quite say this is weaponized, but this is certainly capitalism at work, okay, at a minimum. But we're not going to talk about that. What we are going to talk about is this is a report that came out in 2025 from the National Academies. It's available online. It's called the Cyber Hard Problems. And in it, they list the 10 cyber hard problems that they found. And I actually briefed them and talked to them. And I talked about two. This is one of the ones I talked about, which was just the fact of what we're talking about here is that there are really hard problems with cyber physical systems and operational technology. Okay. And then the other one, which is really what we're going to talk more about today, is this one, system composition. Okay. If engineering is about anything, it's about building things through composition. Okay? And I think for software, that is still a problem. And it is here. But what's even more interesting is this is essentially the third time this study has been done. Okay? The only thing that was common between this 2025 report and the 2005 report was that it's a problem building scalable, secure systems. Okay? But you can even go back to the first time this was done, which was in 97. Secure system composition. Okay? So we have a history now of 25, 30 years. This is the only problem that has been consistent on all three studies, and it's a problem that doesn't seem to be getting solved. Okay? But yet I would argue fundamentally there is no engineering discipline that doesn't work through composition in very rigorous, strong ways. And that's really what I want to talk about today. Any questions?
Funny, but I think you'll answer them.
Okay. So, what did it say about cyber-physical systems? The report said that these cyber-physical systems are bespoke and they're largely opaque. Okay, that really speaks to the software understanding problem that we started with. I think that's pretty obvious what it means. And it said that basically security and resilience are not built in. They're something that is basically just tacked on and in a very ad hoc way. And part of this is most people don't want to even do security when they do. They're forced to do security. It's just a cost. It doesn't really provide any functionality other than it gives you robustness and protection from being attacked, but it doesn't provide functionality to the user. And so security is really heavily minimized. And then what it said for system composition was, without composition rules, which is more often the case, complex systems can be infeasible to evaluate. I mean, this is basically the software understanding problem, okay? And I'm not pretending we solved this problem, okay? If this problem hasn't been solved in 30 years, INL is not going to solve this problem, okay? So I'm not here telling you we've solved the problem. But I'm also going to say we've looked at certain systems and tried to understand how to build systems where you can at least build in security. And it said also that complexity is increasingly a factor in limiting the extent to which it is possible to understand a cyber-physical system. Okay, so that's kind of a wordy sentence, but it's a quote. I think that's true. I don't think any of us would disagree with that. And as I just said, our focus is really how do we build in security, and that's what my group at INL does. And as many of you know, Max was at INL the year before he came here, and Max and I have had a very close and continuing collaboration on this topic. And much of what I'm going to say here should also be credited to Max. Okay, what is this? This is what my laboratory looked like when I was a graduate student, okay? This is not my laboratory. I don't have a picture of it, or I do somewhere, but this was 35 years ago. But a lot of my work was in optics. And when anybody walks into an optics lab, what they think you did was you emptied the stuff from your cabinets and you haven't put it away yet. Okay, because that's kind of what it looks like. But you have to picture laser beams going between these mirrors and all. And this stuff is actually very precisely aligned. Okay, but I'm just putting that out there because that's the environment I grew up in as an experimentalist. Okay. And as a very, very quick summary of my career, professionally, I've been 15 years in the intelligence community, 15 years in the DoD, and 5 years now in the DOE. And that's in chronological order. Started in the intelligence community, now I'm in the DOE. And the area has largely been, I've done a lot of number of special projects, but the ones that keep consistently coming up are in this computing and communications, a lot of work at HPC. Not so much the HPC that like Los Alamos does, which is really the large scale scientific community computing, but other forms of HPC. And what I'm doing now is that other bullet, the security and resilience of cyber physical systems, and that's what we're talking about. And then the other area, which has nothing to do with this talk, is quantum sensors and computing. Okay. This I threw in because this was a very, very influential paper for me. And it comes from a physicist, P.W. Anderson, and it was written in 1972, and it's called More is Different. And as long as you follow what I'm going to say, which I hope you do, it's an interesting paper because it really talks about a lot of how complexity happens, and how at least science is, and at least why science seems to be able to manage complexity better than, say, computer science. And this is going to be a little bit of physics here. That's ammonia. Okay, ammonia is a nitrogen atom with 3 hydrogen, and the hydrogen atoms are electrostatically attracted to the nitrogen. And that's the way a chemist would look at ammonia. Okay, but the problem here is that's not how a physicist sees ammonia. And if you're doing quantum mechanics, okay, and the reason why is because this nitrogen could also be down here. It's got 2 states, okay? And both of these are, and it's just not hydrogen rotated 180 degrees. It's the fact that if you were to try to push this nitrogen down, there would be an energy barrier here that it wouldn't want to go through, but it would get through and it would end up down here, okay? And so what this leads to is a term you probably have heard about called symmetry breaking. And maybe where you heard of symmetry breaking, where it's been in the news, is when they looked for the Higgs boson. They talked a lot about symmetry breaking there. We're not going to talk about that. All I'm saying is that you have these 2 states, nitrogen on top, nitrogen on the bottom. This is the barrier between them. And the way that a physicist would talk about, if you were doing this, if you were treating this as a quantum mechanical system, what you would actually say is that ammonia molecule is really oscillating between those 2 states at about 10 billion times a second. Okay? But no chemist will talk about it that way because it's irrelevant. Okay? And so what happens is, it's very common, and this is what the paper is about, is symmetry breaking. Okay? You get this fact that, yeah, that may be what an ammonia molecule is, but very quickly in the practical world, the symmetry breaks and the molecule kind of looks like that Lego set where you stuck it together. But, and so what the whole point about this paper is that we talk a lot about reductionism, right? Chemistry is nothing but more than applied physics. Biology is nothing more than applied chemistry, etc. And no one would, I think it would be hard to argue that if you put up the standard model of elementary particles, that is probably, quote, our most complete description in the sense that everything reduces to that. But what the real point of the argument is, it's not constructive. It doesn't go in the other way, okay? We don't do chemistry as applied physics. Chemistry has its own rules, and these are emergent, okay? And it goes up that way. And the point that the paper really makes is that it's wrong, or it's not useful to think of chemistry as applied physics. You have to find the rules that make chemistry work. Okay, they're not really easily derivable from physics. You can kind of justify them, you can kind of argue about them, you can kind of make sense. And so the best way to see that for a chemist is this is what drives chemistry. Okay, you think in terms of the periodic table. Mendeleev did the periodic table in the 1850s, 70 years before quantum mechanics. Okay, we got a lot of the rules right about how to do chemistry before we could ever explain what they were. Okay, and to me, this is very interesting. Why is this interesting? And this is where I want to tie it back. Okay, I think doing computer science right is getting the abstractions correct. It's 100% about getting the abstractions correct. But the big difference, but it's harder in computer science. It's much harder than computer science than it is in science. And the reason why is because in science, you have nature, okay? Nature tells you when you're doing something wrong. Nothing tells you you're doing something wrong in computer science, okay? Is the bottom line. It's really what you get down to it. And so, software is largely about getting the right abstractions. And I think you all know this, and good abstractions hide the unnecessary detail, and they allow you to reason about what you're doing at that level of abstraction, much like a chemist can reason at the level of the periodic table and not have to go down to quantum mechanical descriptions. And here's really the problem is, what about bad abstractions? They don't have this clean separation, okay, between the layers. And more importantly, they compound complexity. If you don't get fundamental abstractions right at a lower level, and you're trying to write stuff at a higher level with other abstractions, you've got to account for all the accidental complexity that they generate. And you just, and this complexity just explodes. Okay, I don't know how to be more quantitative about it, but it really is an art form getting the right abstractions. And I'm not going to say I know how to do it, because I certainly don't know how to do it. Okay, but it's clear that if you don't have the right abstractions, you're not going to have the understanding that you need. So now, how did we deal with this? All of our work right now is based on something called the SEL4 microkernel. Has anybody heard of that? Raise your hand if you know what that is. Okay, other than Max, no one knows what that is. Okay, so it's a microkernel, and meaning that it's basically it's the first thing you put on the hardware. Okay, and it's a microkernel because it's not like Linux. Linux is about 20 million lines of code. The SEL4 is only about 10,000 lines of code. And I'm not going to explain this, but it basically gives you what are called capabilities. And capabilities here is not just an arbitrary word. It actually has meanings that go back to the 70s, of where in order to use some resource, you need a capability. And a capability basically has unforgeable keys that allow you to access that capability. And that's and why this was done is because if you formulate it in terms of these capabilities, which I poorly explained, but you get proven confidentiality, integrity, and availability problems. And so this is what the SEL4 microkernel did, is that it gave us a piece of software that is known to be 100% correct with respect to its specifications of CIA. And I'll say what those are a little bit more later. But it also was interesting is that even though it's 10,000 lines, the proof of it is 1 million lines in the theorem prover, and it took 10 years to do. Okay? Now, I don't think you should generalize from that and say all formal methods is that bad, okay, or will take that long. But they were trying to figure out a lot of things about how to write the specification, how to actually do the proof. There is a competing one that was done in Rust, okay, where essentially you have, because of the type checker of Rust, you have a lot more, if you believe the type checker is correct, you have a lot more guarantees that you don't have to go and prove when you're in C. But the other thing is that's challenging too here is that this was proved all the way down to the binary level, okay? And they didn't prove it by proving the correctness of all the compilers and all the tools in the work chain. They established a correspondence between the binary and the C code. Again, don't ask me the questions. I didn't do the proof. Coming from Annapolis, I say formal methods are like boats. It's better to have a friend that has a boat than to own a boat yourself. It's better to have a friend that does formal methods than to do them yourself. And one of the demonstrations that showed this was in 2015, done by DARPA. It was called HACMS. And HACMS basically showed how you can strongly isolate parts of the system. And that's what we're going to talk about. So the fundamental construct of SEL4 are these protection domains, okay? And it's what they create with these capabilities. And if you want a simple description of a protection domain, at least at this level to begin with, it's a sandbox. When you put something in the protection domain, it's strongly isolated from all of the other protection domains. So in that picture, they look like sandboxes. But what's different than them being just sandboxes is some of these capabilities allow communication, okay? And that communication is a very important part of SEL4. And so what you end up with is SEL4 is all about setting up these sandboxes and giving them the resources they need to be essentially split your computer into parts that have strong CIA properties. And to be very explicit here, well, first of all, these protection domains are an excellent abstraction for security, okay? Especially if they have the properties that I just told you about, and that if you're using SEL4, they have these properties through the proof. And just because they do that, it doesn't mean if you use SEL4, everything is great. Okay, you still have to make sure SEL4 loads correctly, and there's other trust problems.
So are you implying then that the IPC communication is copy only and copy forward through the communication?
No. It can be this area. This thing can actually be two directions.
Okay.
No, they're and it can happen both through shared memory.
Okay.
And there's also other mechanisms that are like channels. Okay. And just to be clear about this, confidentiality means that it is impossible for one protection domain to get to see what is inside of another protection domain unless it's given some ability. So for instance, PD2 here can see into PD1 because it's been given a capability that essentially, the other way around. PD1 can see into PD2 because it's been given this capability to have some ability to see, say, memory inside of PD2. And again, remember, what's important here is not that this functionality exists. What's important is that this functionality was proved to be correct. That is 100% essential here, as we'll see. Okay? Integrity basically means one PD can't affect another one in terms of like writing to its memory if it's not given permissions. And then the final one is availability. Is you can't write any code in a protection domain that can fundamentally interfere with the availability of other protection domains from getting their time slices. You can't crash the system. Okay, there's nothing you can do to crash the system from a programmatic level. Okay, these are pretty strong statements and really good statements as a basis of security. And as I said, you only can say you have these, these things only truly exist because of the proof and that you've done the thing right and that you're using it properly. You can make a lot of other claims about CIA that you think you have, but if you don't have this proof and you don't have this foundational understanding, you just don't have it. Watch the time. Okay, I'll move a little bit faster. But one of the problems is when you talk about a system, it's hard to talk about a system in terms of CIA properties. At least I think it is. It's not the most natural way. These are the properties of an element of the system, and certainly you would like to have your system have these properties, but we found that it's really not the best way to talk about it. So we talk about it in terms of dependability, and dependability is basically a system is up and running correctly when it should be. And anytime it goes down when it should be running correctly is a hit against dependability. So this doesn't count stuff like scheduled maintenance. That's factored out. Okay, this has to be dependent, and this is defined in the systems engineering specification as to what dependability means. This is not my definition, but they can go down you can lose dependability at least for 3 reasons. You write bad software, okay, and it crashes. Okay, something breaks in your system. Remember, we're talking about cyber physical systems here, so sensors could break, other things could break. I guess your CPU could even break. Not that happens often. And finally, the one that we're really worried about is cyber attack. Cyber attack can really affect dependability. Okay, and that is why that if your system goes down, the only thing that saves you are what are your resilient modes. How do you handle a system going down in terms of either not letting it crash all the way, or how do you bring it back up? If you don't have good resilience modes programmed in, you will not be able, your dependability will take a hit. But fundamentally, what I want to get across here is you measure dependability. Okay, it's a metric you can measure. Because the other one that we want to talk about, you need assured resilience because of the reasons I just said. The other one that I want to talk about that is very useful, this is trustworthiness. Okay, and again, this is not my definition, but this is the definition from NIST. Trustworthiness is a belief in a system's expected and reliable operation, yada, yada, yada. But what it really means is trustworthiness is an assessment based upon how the system was engineered. Okay, how was it developed? So the fact that SEL4 has a proof behind its correctness with respect to the CIA should give you a lot better confidence that trustworthiness is high in a system that is properly engineered. Okay, but it's not, at least the way it's formulated here, it is not a metric. And so, well, I said that. And you know, trustworthiness tends to degrade over time. It's never going to probably get better. And the reason why, and this is really what we're really worried about, your system can be fully dependable. You can have a cyber adversary that's in your system that does all the compromise except for pull the trigger. So essentially here, your dependability is still perfect, but your trustworthiness has gone to zero and you don't even know it. Mm-hmm. Okay? Because if an adversary has done this, they have the choice of when to make you lose your dependability. Okay, that really is the crux of the problem that we're trying to solve here. And that's a very hard problem to solve. Right, and we call that having a system held at risk. Okay, when the adversary does this, your system is at risk. And there's other ways that we think you can do continual assessment to make trustworthiness more of a metric based upon the observables you look at. Not going to talk about that today. We can talk about that later. So I want to kind of drill some of these points home. If you're talking anything that's a system, okay, the aspect that's really important is systems have boundaries. Okay, you don't really have a system if you don't have a boundary. And I'm not saying the boundary is always this hard outer shell. That's just the way I drew it. Okay, but why that's important is because you typically define a system between the users which are in the environment. How do they interact? What are their allowed modes to interact with the system? This is part of essentially requirements. Okay, and you could also just as easily have systems talking to other systems, okay, as part of the requirement. And that's more like the world that we're living into. And so the challenge that you have is you only don't get your authorized users interacting with your system. You get the adversary also interacting with the system. You don't have to pay extra for it. It comes with your environment, okay? It's just there. And again, it's going to also manifest itself in terms of corrupted systems interacting with your system. It's always not the hacker knocking on your door as a person, okay? And so, and to a large degree, this is, I don't know what you want to call this, recursive, fractal. Systems can be composed of systems. Your body is composed of cells. Cells are systems, okay? So why this, and we take a very systems-oriented perspective. And I'd love to talk about it. I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but how I want to connect with this. Okay, so again, you know, what you want to think about is maybe that user is interacting with some part of your system. Well, that becomes the adversary. That's going to corrupt some part of maybe a subsystem of your system. Now, why this matters, and that basically says, yeah, maybe you were born corrupted. Maybe you had a supply chain attack, okay? And you actually build a system and you built the adversary into your system. We don't really deal with that problem just because we can't do anything. We know some ways of dealing with that problem. But what I wanted to really talk about is on this next slide. It's interesting, there's a little tax. Yeah, I guess you can guess what's coming next. If you build a system out of Linux, okay, rather than SEL4, and I got to say one thing here. Just because you use SEL4 doesn't mean you can't use Linux. You just put Linux in one of the protection domains. Okay, so it sits on top of a protection domain. So I'm not saying it's one or the other. You either build it with SEL4 or you build it with Linux. Please don't take that message away. Okay, you could easily put Linux into a protection domain. But when you do this, you're working in a Linux system. Okay, you now have all of these Linux processes around that you built your system out of. Again, you're probably, maybe the user is interacting with one of them. But the problem is, so is the adversary. Okay, and the adversary will probably be able to corrupt that. And the problem with Linux for high assurance systems is once that happens, you have a high likelihood the whole system is going to fall. Okay. Basically, they'll own the system. All your processes are corrupted. Your resilience processes, everything is gone. Okay. I'm not saying that's a guarantee, but you certainly don't have a guarantee that that's not going to happen. Okay. And with 26 million lines of code, granted, I would trust more when my car boots with Linux than if it boots with Windows. But I still don't have confidence that Linux is necessarily used in its raw form like this, what you really want to do for a high assurance system. Whereas if you look at building a system on top of SEL4, you have a very different construct. And that construct is that now the protection domains become these nodes. They can communicate, and you still can have the same thing. One of these protection domains can be set to talk to the outside world. The rest of them are internal. And so that if that one gets corrupted, okay, the rest of them are probably not going to fall. Now, that's based up. Now, you could say, well, if these two have communications, why can't he just communicate over that? Yes, you have to worry about that. And yes, we do worry about that. And that was one of the problems that I gave to Max. And that's why I don't know if Max has talked about datum here, but that's one of the things that we did was to really say, how do we really restrict those protocols that will be communicated over these in our types of systems so that it's going to be hard for the adversary to move through the system. And Max did that largely by turning protocols into a type system using session types. And he did this in F-star, talk to Max. And our goal this year is to get that into Rust in some usable way. And so your system doesn't fall. Now what all of this means, basically, is that all of these protection domains really form this graph. Okay, the nodes are the protection domains. The edges are these communications that we've talked about. And forming the graph is not that unique. You could say Linux processes form a graph. Okay, but what this really means, though, is that even under attack, you have reasonable confidence in the way you engineer the system that this graph will persist. Okay, because you can stop the adversary from moving through the system. Okay, and what this really means and where we're heading with this is I'm giving these nodes some different colors because what they really are, and I'm not going to talk about this because it just gets too jargony and it gets too detailed and it will put you all to sleep, even Max, or it'll make you pull out your iPhones. But think of these as being applications. Okay, think of this as being the application that's running your cyber physical system, doing the work that you want to do. Okay, think of this as being a runtime monitor that is trying to understand that, hey, my system is not working correctly. Okay, this would be strongly isolated from adversaries by SEL4. Okay, and so that if that runtime verification started to say, gee, something's just not right here, I need to trigger a resilience mode to take in place. You have that resilience mode there because an adversary that gets in through the main application will not be able to affect your resilience mode. Okay, and this is some of the abstractions that we're trying to use to build the system. Okay. Okay. I'm nearing the end. And we've been working on this now about 4 years, and like I said, there's other precedences. There are other groups that are trying to do the same thing. Okay, so we're not unique here. Okay, there are some things that we're doing that is different than other people, and we have reasons for doing them. But what the Cyber Hard Problems report said was basically a key enabler composition is how do you minimize interaction among system elements. I hope I've convinced you that's why you want to use SEL4. Maybe it doesn't necessarily minimize interaction, but it certainly lets you structure them and control them. Okay? And we were doing this long before the Cyber Hard report came out. But it really, and it's also the way science works. I mean, interaction in physics is pretty much local. It's not, you don't have what I do here affecting something halfway across the universe. Okay, you really have to think in terms of these interactions and all, and how you're going to monitor it. And this is what it said: functions are partitioned so that an error in one partition does not adversely affect other partitions. I hope that I convinced you that's what we're trying to do with that previous view graph. And then the other thing that it said, and this was not me, even though I talked to these people because I never mentioned this, future systems have to be shaped by cyber-informed engineering. What is cyber-informed engineering? That's I don't want to call it a standard because it's not a standard, but that's a development methodology that you can download from the Department of Energy. It's on their website, but it was also developed at Idaho National Laboratory. And it has 10 principles. Those are the 10 principles. I'm not going to read them to you. You can go download this yourself. But there's really 4 that play a role here. Consequence-focused design. What are your critical functions? Okay, how are you going to isolate and protect your critical functions in a cyber-physical system? How do you control access to it? Again, this is going back to what I said about SEL4. How do you protect important data? And number 10, how do you plan for resilience because you know you're going to need it? Okay, and with that, I think I'll stop here. Questions, discussions, clarifications? Yes.
So, does SEL4 verifies the kernel or the system?
It certainly doesn't do the system.
Okay.
What it verifies is the microkernel, and the microkernel is 10,000 lines of code, and it basically says how do you share the resources of the computer, meaning the memory and essentially time slots and communication, in a way that will preserve CIA confidentiality. That's all that it does. SEL4 in its raw form is wickedly, wickedly hard to use. Okay. The true test of AI programming is if it can develop an SEL4 system for you. It can. And I've had people that have tried, and they have had no success. That's all that it does. But what it does is it strongly guarantees that you can share these resources with respect to CIA. And as I said, you could then take one of those protection domains and put Linux in it. Okay. And you could run your whole system off of Linux running off of that. And you could have another protection domain that has another copy of Linux in it. Okay. And it doesn't have to necessarily, and they could even, well, you may not want them to have the same share this. You may actually want 2 copies.
Yeah.
What?
You don't want them to.
Yeah, you probably don't. I know. I stopped that comment. But you could have that other Linux responsible for executing some of your resilient modes. And a lot of times in these systems, you don't need full-blown Linux. You often only need a subset of POSIX. And people have done subset of POSIX that are only a couple 100,000 lines of code for the real POSIX that you need. You don't need file systems a lot of times. And you just don't need a lot of the complexity. Yes.
So do these protected domains from the SEL4, does that kind of potentially give you a means of doing the trustworthy assessment in a little more of a real time? I thought that was an interesting distinction between like dependability and trustworthiness. It feels like there's the ability to like get a sense, but
I wouldn't. That's not how we're thinking about doing real-time assessments of trustworthiness. To say a bad word here, we are thinking about doing trustworthiness in terms of like a probabilistic digital twin. Okay. You all know what the bad word is. And so what that really means is that now your physical system is doing whatever physics says. Okay. But you have a number of observables and actuators into your physical world. That's what a cyber physical system is. Okay. You build up information that you can start to do statistical inference from as to whether or not things are working right. So one of the clear examples that we want to do is we talked about data enforcing protocols through the type system, so that you won't even compile if you don't have your protocols used according to standard. Now, we're still going to monitor protocols. And if you see protocols starting to be violated, that's a good indicator that something is not working right. Because if you wrote your applications in Rust and you did the type system properly, that should not happen in your system by a pretty strong guarantee of the type system being correct for protocols. And so that starts to say, I may not have as much trustworthiness in my system as I thought I had, because I'm seeing protocol violations being thrown that shouldn't be there. Does that help answer the question?
I think so. Yeah.
So does SEL4 work with the attestation models that are being applied to Linux and to other systems?
I don't know what that means.
I guess SEL4 provides so you said that SEL4 provides the cryptography within the capabilities of the systems that it's using, right?
Yes.
And so moving forward onto the next layer for Linux and other things, you would provide that through UEFI or some other system to ensure that it's booting with the correct kernels and have that chain from the very bottom all the way up?
So that would be the idea, yes. I don't know that you need to necessarily do it through UEFI.
Okay.
So you would have to have a secure boot that meant SEL4 booted correctly. Okay. And that is not in SEL4, obviously.
Okay.
But there are ways to do that. Okay, but it requires hardware.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But then once you have SEL4 booting correctly, you can have, high integrity loadings of the software that has to be that would certify, yes, this is the code that the developer wants to run. Okay, not saying it's correct.
Yeah.
But at least saying it's the code that is supposed to be running. And again, some of this is on our plans to do, and there's a much larger talk about this. Because what I didn't talk about is we are working with a company that, and it's been very much a collaboration. It's a startup called Kryten, KRY10. There's not much on their website, but I can certainly put you in contact with them and we can talk about it more. But there's a lot of these notions about how to formally define a manifest, and which would contain a lot of that information, and certify that the manifest loaded correctly under the assumption that SEL4 loaded correctly, which then has to go back to hardware. So yes, I think there are ways forward. They may be a little bit modified from today, because UEFI to me is more at a hardware level.
Yeah.
Right. So you wouldn't be using that once you got SEL4 on the system.
Yeah.
Other questions?
I think one more thing that you could talk about to give the audience a little more context is the applications of the technology and the stack that you just discussed to ORANs and 6G at a very high level.
Okay.
And the in-progress work on INRAD and how those ideas interact with the work there. And you might also want to give some context for INRAD and why that's...
Okay, so let me do the easy one first. ORAN, what is Max talking about? So RANs are radio access networks. That's what your cell phone connects to. Those are all the cell towers and the networks that they form. RANs are monopolies from like Ericsson, Nokia, Huawei, and Samsung. And so there's the notion of wanting to open up this architecture of RANs so that they can be more competitive. This is being driven by the service providers. I'm not convinced it will happen, but regardless, there are some interesting innovations that are likely to happen. One of the things that they do is they largely import the RAN stack from the 5G standards. Okay? But what they add to it is something called the RIC, the RAN Intelligent Controller, which can host third-party apps. And those apps have access to pretty key information the way it's envisioned. And there's a lot of reasons why this may be a good extension, even if the whole system doesn't become open, but someone like an Ericsson decides to put in the ability to host these apps. And so this was one of our first applications for what I talked about. Okay. And basically we took an open source package of ORANs called SRS RAN. You can download it. It comes out of a company in Ireland. It is a company out of Ireland. The founders are from Trinity College, which is a strong wireless school. And we basically have gotten parts of that to work on SEL4 system. The only reason we haven't completed it, and I said parts, is it's just a question of time and money and priorities. And you know, it will get done. It's just a question of how does it get scheduled. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is engage. The DoD is very interested in this technology. So one of the things that we're trying to engage is how to basically host third-party apps in a wireless network and increase the security through the methods I just talked about. The other one that Max mentioned was there is a large push at INL, which goes back to my very first slide showing the small modular reactor, about how do you make nuclear energy more autonomous. It can run itself. Maybe a scary thought, would be a scary thought for me, but you know, what gives you some confidence that this can be doable is nuclear reactors are basically physically designed so that they can't Chernobyl on you. Okay, there is nothing you can physically do in the operation of a nuclear reactor that basically makes it explode. Yeah, a plane could crash into it and it could be a problem, some extraordinary event like that. And so the question becomes, you know, how do you make these systems more autonomous? There are various factors that are trying to get addressed here. I know that Chris Ritter is one of our leads for this at INL. He was here earlier this week, I believe. And one of the things that we're concerned about is the fact that you can't afford that control room and those peoples to watch every modular reactor you put out there. How do you have a control center that is more centrally distributed or centrally located that handles a distributed number of reactors in a secure way? And again, it's not as much about if something fails here, the reactor will blow up. If something fails here, they could turn the reactor off, okay, or they could make it not operate. There's no conceivable mechanism because you have to define nuclear reactors so that they're safe, and that basically means having very positive physical control. And so that's probably the largest research effort at the laboratory. Is there anything you want to add that I missed?
Yeah, I guess to both. So with ORANs and one of the key technologies that's emerging in 6G and emerging ORAN software packages are supporting a large set of 6G technology as well as remote sensing enabled by XApps. And then if you look at companies like Palantir, what they're envisioning is a world where soldiers are using generative AI to create on-the-fly modular remote sensing based applications. So you're going to have AI generated code running inside of the same radio stack being used to communicate by soldiers in the field. And that horrifies some people because these things run as Linux processes. And that should scare us. And so again, using SL4 is important here because then you can say, well, we know that barring the correctness of our hardware, these XApps in the RIC can't break out. And the second bit is with the work on the modular reactors, there's active efforts underway to basically take the architecture that Lance showed and use it to show simple properties like operator primacy when you have a human taking over an autonomous nuclear reactor.
So Max, is RIC RIC REK?
RIC, the RAN, R stands for the RAN, the Radio Access Network Intelligent Controller is what RIC stands for. And it's a pretty common term out there once you get into this. It's not an obscure term. The other thing I'll say just for fun is 6G is supposed to have a radar waveform in it. So you can actually do radar type things from cell towers.
Yeah, so that's exactly the kind of AI powered app where you want to.
Well, we're already seeing it be deployed in enterprises for Wi-Fi. So I went to the Samsung site at one point and they'd shut down your Wi-Fi if you had a rogue Wi-Fi network. or a hotspot, and they target that and shut it down.
Yeah, you could. That's certainly a detector of that. But this is more something that could possibly say there are drones flying in your area.
Yeah.
Okay, you
Okay.
can do that type of stuff with this. And so I think one of the reasons why Max wanted me to talk here is that, I have I've had a PhD for almost 40 years and never been associated. Well, never really been associated with an academic institution. I've certainly spent a lot of times at them. And to show that, this is some of the things that you do with a PhD in the non-academic world. There are still very challenging problems. Okay, there's still a lot of research to do here. The emphasis is not always on publications, even though INL has a very strong emphasis on publication through the DOE. But it's really about developing capabilities that require research. And and I want to say that it's a fun world to work in, but it certainly changed over my career. It's just every place is getting more brutal to do really fun work and to do really impactful work. It's just hard. I'll be honest. Okay.
Thank you.